Is there a real deal to end the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran? With Israel promising to continue its occupation of southern Lebanon, plus no clarity on the status of nuclear inspectors, can any agreement keep the peace? And will the Strait of Hormuz stay open? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is the Newsmakers. There is relative peace in the Gulf for now, while technical talks to craft a final agreement have been paused until next week. Though some call it progress, the dangerous back and forth remains the same. A pattern in which the U.S. says one thing has been agreed, only for Iran to come back and say it hasn't. For now, Tehran insists there's no agreement to allow nuclear inspectors back in the country, while the U.S. says there is. And more crucially, Israel continues to defy calls to stop its assault on Lebanon, which Iran sees as a deal breaker. Here's a look now at where peace stands.
The Memorandum of Understanding between Iran and the US was signed just days ago, but the foundations of a sturdier and more lasting end to the war already show signs of resting on shaky ground. Iran's foreign ministry said implications of its nuclear sites were not happening.
We neither had a meeting with the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, nor do we have any plan for the agency to inspect Iran's nuclear facilities damaged as a result of the US military aggression and the Zionist regime.
But the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Grossi, said paragraph 8 of the MOU was explicit and agreed to by both presidents. The IAEA was to inspect all nuclear facilities and material. The assertion was backed up by the US president.
They're wrong. They're wrong. They know they're wrong. They told us inside, and we have it down 100% inspections. And if they were right, I'd cancel the meetings right now.
Multiple points of contention exist between the US and Iran across several parts of the Memorandum of Understanding.
Definitely, the situation in the Strait of Hormuz will not be the same as it was before the war. And definitely the arrangement for passage of vessels through the Strait of Hormuz will not be the same.
US Secretary of State Marco Rubio was in Abu Dhabi on Tuesday as he toured the Gulf, visiting allies in the region. He rejected any possibility of tolls on the strait.
Well, that's the law. It's an international waterway. No country is allowed to charge tolls or fees on an international waterway. That's existing international law. That's the way it is in international waterways all over the world, and that's the way we expect it'll be here.
The UN's International Maritime Organization Secretary General said a large-scale evacuation of 11,000 seafarers stranded on the Strait of Hormuz would be carried out. He said the organization had secured the cooperation of Iran, Oman, and other coastal states in the Gulf, the US, and the maritime industry. Oman has also agreed not to impose charges on the strait, which also falls within its territorial waters. And there are suggestions from US Vice President J.D. Vance as to how unfrozen Iranian financial assets would be spent.
Jared Kushner actually came up with a very interesting solution with the Qataris, where basically, again, if there is any frozen Iranian assets that are unfrozen, then we have approval over that process, the Qataris have approval over that process, and then the money would actually go to buy American soy, American corn, and American wheat for the benefit of the Iranian people.
Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian, while visiting Pakistan, said only Iran would decide how to use those assets. Israel's continued attacks and presence in southern Lebanon are also complicating matters. Israel says this is to defend itself against Hezbollah, but Iran views Israel's continued aggression in Lebanon to be a violation of the MOU. The US considers it an entirely separate, unrelated conflict and not part of any wider negotiations with Iran. And the US Congress also threw its president a curveball, the Senate voting 50-48, demanding he must seek approval before any more military action in Iran. Though that vote was symbolic, rather than an act of official legislation. This is the closest the US and Iran have got to peace since the war began on February 28th. But at this stage, even the Memorandum of Understanding they signed is, so far, only a paper guarantee.
Joining me now to look at where negotiations really stand are from Tehran, director of the think tank Diplo House Iran, Hamidreza Gholamzadeh. From New York, non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, Amir Handjani. And from London, director of the American Military Project at the Claremont Institute, Will Thibeau. Thanks all so much for being with me. Amir, I'll begin with you and ask simply, how much do you consider this progress for the long term when you have a barely two-page MOU that both sides are making contradictory statements about, and now less than 2 months to work everything out? Should we feel good about where this is going?
Well, I think we should feel good about the fact that the Straits of Hormuz are seemingly more open today than they were a week ago. There are not missiles and rockets being fired all over the Persian Gulf and into Israel and Iran. So I think that's a positive. As far as the terms of the MOU, I think they reflect the fact that the United States is trying to get diplomatically what it could not get militarily, which is they tried to use maximum pressure and then use maximum force to get the stated goal of the operation was regime change. That didn't happen, and Iran had the endurance, and it caused a great deal of damage to the global economy in the region. And therefore, when a great power doesn't win a war conclusively, what do? They go to the negotiating table, and that's where we are right now.
But do you think they can stick with the negotiating table? Can they truly accept that the force alone that they applied didn't get them what they wanted?
You know, I don't think for the U.S. going back to force is going to make it any better, because if the U.S. applies more military force on Iran, Iran will just apply more military force in the Persian Gulf, and will start leveling more energy infrastructure.
And that's a logical rationale. But do you think, again, that I'll put it this way, that the egos in Washington will accept that?
I think that President Trump and Vice President Vance, Mr. Kushner and Mr. Witkoff in particular, have come to the conclusion that if more military force were to be applied, it would have disastrous consequences for American allies in the region and the global economy, and thereby the American economy going into the midterm elections. So I don't see a resumption of hostilities in the near term, unless Iran does something unusual that would precipitate an American response.
Okay. Let me ask Hamidreza then. I mean, we know Washington is saying that the Iran for the win narrative is just Tehran pandering to its domestic audience. And when your leaders contradict the U.S. line, they're saying it's only for local news purposes, really. I mean, is there any truth to that?
You know, both sides are accusing one another of the same thing, that Iranians say that whatever President Trump or J.D. Vance and other American officials are making claims are for domestic usage, and the Americans are saying the same about the Iranians. But about the win narrative, I think that the dominating narrative across the world is that the Americans have failed in this war, and Iran was actually the real winner of the war. So Iran says that the biggest leverage has been used against me and it didn't work. So not only I have been the winner of the war, but also I can impose my will on the other side, and I can ask any demands that I want in order to save my interests and to follow my own national interests. But as Amir just mentioned, President Trump and the American administration wants to achieve those things that they could not win in the war through diplomacy and through negotiations. And when it gets to excessive demands, it is where the MOU and the negotiations would be very fragile. It is understandable that any negotiation is give and take, and you give something, you take something. But if you want to give nothing and take everything, where you have earned nothing in the war, and you want to replace everything in the negotiations, that would be a damage to the negotiations. And that's the way we are seeing from the American administration. Right now, there are a lot of controversies and discussions inside Iran after the recent visit to Switzerland and the negotiations that they had. J.D. Vance says that Iran is supposed to buy crops from American products.
Okay.
While Iranians do not agree about that, or the inspectors and everything else are the points of difference that is based on these approach.
Right. Okay. Before we get further into those points of difference, let me get Will's take on the analyses you just heard. And let me ask you as well, do you think it is risky to have the U.S. making statements that Iran says aren't true? As I mentioned, there's some will say there are fragile egos at play here, and those discrepancies could set off something much bigger if one party seems to feel humiliated here.
Well, regardless of the messaging campaigns from Iran, the United States, other parts of the world, factions within the United States, I think it's undeniable that there is real momentum for diplomacy. A few weeks ago, I think it would have been surprising to many if the Vice President of the United States was leading a delegation to negotiate in person in Switzerland, as he did this past week. And that's the signal to which the world should pay attention. Candidly, I think it's a little tired to try and measure foreign policy outcomes like a game in the World Cup of soccer, because this is, as was said, a give and take. It's not going to be a binary outcome, but there is an undeniable reality that both sides are willing to seriously consider how you started the show, with some progress towards a diplomatic solution. And I think that's welcome news. I think that's a good thing. And I think both Iran and the United States will probably find items that result from these discussions over the next 60 days that they can be happy about. And yes, perhaps some that aren't such welcome news. But that is, I think, a foreign policy reality. We're not playing a game of risk here.
Okay. So speaking of those positive diplomatic efforts, Will, do you appreciate Marco Rubio's visit to the Gulf right now, meeting with various allies there? Is it productive? Is it helping? Or do you fear that there will be more points of difference brought up in his individual talks?
No, I think the narrative of, different personalities and factions within the Trump administration is just that, an overblown narrative from the outside. I think it's, by all accounts, when it comes to the actual implementation of foreign policy, although some leaders, whether it be Secretary Rubio, Vice President Vance, embody, different personas of a negotiating team, maybe it's good cop, bad cop. They are still implementing President Trump's vision for a future of the Middle East. And I think Secretary Rubio's visit to the Gulf states, to some of the Gulf states, is a sign of how this slate of negotiations is perhaps different from previous ones. America clearly sees the value of generating buy-in and literally, financial buy-in from the Gulf states in a future with Iran as a way to create a more enduring series of partnerships in the region that can allow the United States to turn the page on the Middle East, actually implement the national security strategy that President Trump and his team released late last year, focus on the Western Hemisphere, our homeland, and the Indo-Pacific. So this is, I think, a parallel supporting effort to, Vice President Vance's place at the, spearhead of the negotiating team. And again, it should be a welcome sign.
Okay. Let me see how much Amir agrees there, and also ask Amir what you think the chances are that the Strait of Hormuz will, first of all, stay open, as well as those on the less positive side, the chances that Israel could refuse to cooperate in this scenario and prove, again, the spoiler for a lot of this?
No, I agree wholeheartedly with what Will said. I think this is an opportunity. In all diplomacy is gives and takes. There are going to be aspects of the deal, if it comes to fruition, that the U.S. body politic is not going to be happy with. They're going to have to hold their nose to, and there are going to be aspects of the deal that Iran and then their internal politics are not going to like. That's what happens when you conduct diplomacy. At the same time, you have to, I think, what many here in the United States are asking ourselves is, why do we have to undergo this exercise of war for the last 4 months to do a deal that could have been available before February 27th? And could we here be giving up more leverage to Iran, giving up more to Iran in a deal that we wouldn't have had to give up had we not conducted military operations? So I think that's the reckoning, the long-term reckoning from this this conflict. As far as Israel playing spoiler, Israel is very dependent on the United States for so many things, for interceptors, for intelligence, defense technology, offensive weapons. I think back to what President Clinton said after he met Prime Minister Netanyahu in the 90s. He said, who's the, beeping superpower here? And I think President Trump is going to reassert that if he need to be. He wants a deal. He wants it done. He's not going to let Israel play spoiler. If Israel's playing spoiler, it's going to be because the U.S. has given it a tacit approval to play spoiler. And as far as where we are today, I don't think that's likely.
Okay, let me ask Hamidreza about that then, because there are some who say there needs to be this push for Iran to drop its demands over Lebanon, because Lebanon is a sovereign country where the government is involved now in its own negotiations with Israel to stop Israeli bombings via Washington. And Iran seems to insist that it needs to make Lebanon a fundamental part of its agenda because, well, the cynical side would say because Iran wants to use it as leverage, but Iranians would say that these are our people to support Lebanon, and Hezbollah is part of Iran's fabric. We need to defend them.
We are talking about a durable peace and stability in the region. And it never happens without having ceasefire in all fronts. It's like a domino, and you cannot say that you are the piece number 3 and you cannot be concerned about piece number 1 or piece number 7, for example. When domino moves, every single piece would drop, and that's the nature of this region. That the security of the whole region is connected to one another. So you cannot have, for example, terrorist groups in Afghanistan and you live in peace in Iran or in Lebanon, in Iraq, or you have terrorists in Syria and you be very enjoying a luxurious life in other parts of the region. That is the nature of this volatile part of the world, that the security and stability is connected and intertwined between all the countries. So
you can say it's connected, Hamidreza, but what people are concerned about is the pure sovereignty of Lebanon itself and the role that the government should have in negotiating its own future here, rather than having Iran play the broker for peace in Lebanon.
Iran is not making a political decision for the Lebanese government or for the Lebanese people. It is about stopping war there. It's not demanding anything from the Lebanese, or is not imposing any wheels on the Lebanon administration or people whatsoever. It's actually connecting its own security to the security of Lebanon. Iran is not saying that, for example, that person should be the president or prime minister in Lebanon, or the political structure should be like this. And we know that the American ambassador is blatantly doing that. Iran says that I am connecting my own security to the security of Lebanon because they want there to be peace. And we are seeing that how the Lebanese army and the Lebanese government are protecting the people of Lebanon, and they're doing nothing actually, I would say, very frankly. But the reality is that Iran is sacrificing itself for the future and the security of Lebanon. Is not the other way around.
Okay.
I don't think they would be very sensible to say that the Lebanese government wants war for its own people. So
Okay.
I don't think that would be very common sense.
Hamidreza, I mean, I'd like to get some responses to that, but we have so little time, and I have to look at the other major potential obstacle in all of this. And we remember Iran has always said it never wanted a nuclear weapon. It's not compatible with the Islamic Republic values. So isn't that an easy ask right now? Just allow inspectors in at this point to monitor the civilian program. If all you want is a civilian program, why is that such a major sticking point for these negotiations going forward?
Iran has been under the most serious inspection program by the IAEA, and it actually damaged Iranian security. And once it is clear that the information for Iranian scientists and Iranian facilities have been given to the Americans and Israelis via IAEA. So it is about security. It's not about pursuing a nuclear weapon or something like that. And those facilities that are under question, Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan, have been bombarded in last year, June, and in a recent war in February and March, it was attacked by the Americans and they are damaged. So there is no access to that in order to do. But the point is not access. It is about the threat that Iran feels from Rafael Grossi and the IAEA and politicization of the nuclear program that they are carrying out against Iran. And as long as this threat is in place, Iran is not interested in working with the inspectors because they are providing information right to the hands of the Israelis and the Americans.
Okay, let me ask Will if you think that is a fair position for Iran to argue here. Because also having said that, remember the U.S. said it eliminated the program already in the 12-day war. So what is Washington really fussing about?
Washington wants a real path towards a permanent end to any notion or possibility that Iran would have a nuclear weapon. They don't want a 10-year sunset. I think they want a more robust inspection regime than what was available under the JCPOA. And I do think there's the chance that there'll be concessions about a nuclear program writ large, if you kind of read in between the lines of recent statements from President Trump even. So again, a perfect instance of when both parties will have to give a little to get a lot of peace. And call me silly or Pollyannish, but I actually think there's some possibility here. Obviously, a few instances of war and high intensity conflict have disrupted, what was reported, a little over a year ago now was even some Iranian willingness to have American inspectors as part of an IAEA package. I candidly don't think Israel would ever have access to that inspection team. But in any case, the both sides know that this is going to be a place where there's going to be give and take. I do think it's possible. I think Americans need to get comfortable with an existing civilian nuclear program, existing peaceful enrichment. And I think Iran will have to accept a reality of inspection to ensure that there's no chance of weaponization. And then the everything else in the deal exists kind of as a, infrastructure, economic, military, and otherwise to ensure that the persistence of this deal over the nuclear program continues.
Okay.
And it's, to me, that's been the objective of President Trump for a while.
Just a minute left. So, Amir, your thoughts then on the nuclear issue, as well as if there should be a push for Iran to drop its demands on Lebanon, again, sovereign country where the government is involved in its own negotiations. Where do you stand on those two issues? Do you think they can be resolved diplomatically?
I agree with Will. I certainly think that the nuclear issue can be resolved. I think Iran has come to the table on the nuclear issue over the last 15 years, beginning with the JCPOA again, as Will said, before the war, again, before the war in June of last year, and in between the war in June and this war. So I think Iran is going to offer concessions there, and they're going to be similar to the concessions that they offered over the last year. As far as Lebanon goes, I don't think Iran is going to be as flexible on Lebanon as the US or Israel would like, because it views Lebanon as a forward defense to Israel. And it views Hezbollah as an ally, proxy of itself. And I think they're going to demand that Israel withdraw from Lebanon, and the high intensity conflict that's going on there be brought to an end. And I think Iran's going to have to also be comfortable with the fact that there's going to be some sort of force in between Lebanon and Israel that's not going to be Hezbollah, whether that's UN peacekeepers or it's going to be the Lebanese army. I think that's sort of the formula for resolving this.
Will, we're out of time, but I'm going to ask one additional question to you, because it has been a headline as of the last 24 hours, and that's about the War Powers Act. There was a lot said about President Trump refusing to get congressional approval for the war in the first place, and now we're hearing the War Powers measure was passed, but that it's only symbolic. I wonder, what is the point of the balance of powers now in the U.S. if Congress has no say over the nation going to war in the first place?
I do want to take your question seriously, and it's a good one. I just think it's so irrelevant, candidly. I think the U.S. regime will often use procedural questions to disrupt the other side when they don't want to confront the merits of a given issue. That's certainly true with war fighting, and candidly, I'm not even sure of the exact status. I think U.S. presidents have a lot of latitude to exercise U.S. foreign policy as they see fit. I think that's largely a narrative affirmed, by a good kind of stream of left, moderate, right, and left wing jurisprudence. And the War Powers Act is just kind of a way for those who oppose the president to kind of throw sand in the gears of the administration, so that they don't have to earnestly confront the merits of a given issue and have, the real, I think, interesting question on what is the proper course of U.S. foreign policy.
I'm just curious as to why it was so essential in the lead up to the war in Iraq, but in this case, it doesn't seem to apply.
Well, I think the war in Iraq was not framed as a, right, reasonably or not, rightly or wrongly, the war in Iraq was not framed as a limited campaign. There was an effort to build an international coalition. It was a more complete U.S. ground invasion from the jump, and think of Operation Epic Fury however you want, but President Trump framed it as such from the beginning. It was I forget the euphemism, but a limited military campaign against a proximate threat that the U.S. identified in the Iranian regime. And I think there's you can, again, debate the merits, but there's distinction there.
Sort of like a special military operation. Okay, very unfortunately, that's going to have to be the final word for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with me, and our viewers for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We will see you next time.